What if Sam Raimi's Spider-Man starred Heath Ledger as Peter Parker, featured a much more terrifying-looking Green Goblin, in addition to a secondary villain in Dr. Octopus, and even included a cameo from Hugh Jackman's Wolverine? Believe it or not, all of these things almost happened. So to find out how we went from all of that to the movie we got, let's dive in and take a look at what could have been Sam Raimi's Spider-Man. Attempts to bring Spider-Man to the big screen date all the way back to the 1980s, beginning with B-movie producer Roger Corman, who held an early option on the character and began developing the film at Orion Pictures. Stan Lee was even brought in to write a draft of the script, which leaned into Cold War themes and featured Dr. Octopus as the villain, but budget disputes and the failure of films like Superman 3 made comic book movies a tough sell, and the project collapsed. The rights were then picked up by B-movie studio The Cannon Group, who completely misunderstood the character. At one point, they envisioned Spider-Man as a literal human tarantula hybrid in a horror-style story directed by Texas Chainsaw Massacre director Tobe Hooper. That version was scrapped after major pushback from Stan Lee, leading to multiple rewrites that brought the story closer to the comics, with Dr. Octopus as a mentor-turned-villain. The studio even considering casting names like Tom Cruise as Peter Parker and Bob Hoskins as Doc Ock. But after two of Cannon's major films, Superman 4 and Masters of the Universe, bombed, Cannon collapsed, and the film died with it. The rights would eventually land at Kuroko Pictures, the studio behind Terminator 2, which is how James Cameron became attached to write and direct. We've covered Cameron's version in a previous video, but suffice to say, it was dark, very 90s, featuring swearing, sex, and a reimagined Electro as a megamaniacal businessman with Sandman as his heavy. Cameron also introduced the idea of organic webbing, which would carry over to the finished film. Cameron desperately wanted to make the film, calling it the greatest movie he never made, but it became tangled in a web of lawsuits over the rights, delaying the project until he ultimately walked away. Sony would eventually purchase the rights from Marvel, after Blade and X-Men proved that a Marvel property could do well at the box office. To write it, Sony hired Jurassic Park scribe David Koepp, whose first versions of the script were very different from what we ended up with. Koepp's draft featured not one, but two antagonists, the Green Goblin and Dr. Octopus. In this version, Osborn is developing experimental tech, with an eye toward lucrative government contracts, and one of his most ambitious projects is led by Dr. Otto Octavius. Outfitted with a mechanical harness, Octavius uses the arms to safely handle various chemical-filled test tubes, as he develops a compound to boost strength and intelligence, but it currently comes with terrifying side effects, like heightened aggression and insanity. Tensions between Octavius and Norman eventually boil over, sending Otto into a fit of rage. The tentacles lash out uncontrollably, smashing through lab equipment and rupturing canisters. In the chaos, a massive explosion tears through the facility, hurling Octavius backward and leaving Norman unconscious as a sickly green vapor begins to creep towards his body, which he inhales, turning him into the Green Goblin. Meanwhile, Octavius is left horribly burned and pinned beneath the wreckage, his mechanical harness fused permanently to his flesh. From there, the Goblin's motivations take a remarkably dark turn. Instead of targeting Spider-Man, Osborn wants to actually kill his own son Harry, believing he's responsible for the downfall of Oscorp. Meanwhile, Doc Ock wants revenge on Osborn for destroying his life's work and turning him into a monster, setting the stage for a chaotic three-way battle at the climax. In the end, Osborn is defeated and taken into police custody, while Doc Ock manages to escape to set up the sequel. At one point, Fight Club director David Fincher was seriously considered for the directing job, but Fincher wasn't interested in the standard superhero film. He felt that dedicating an entire film to Spider-Man's origin story was dumb. Instead, he pitched putting Spider-Man's entire origin in the opening credits, and jumping straight into adapting the night Gwen Stacy died for the very first movie. Unsurprisingly, a studio looking to launch an accessible four-quadrant franchise wasn't interested in starting with such a bleak approach. Instead, the studio found the perfect match in Sam Raimi, who was ultimately hired to direct specifically because he was a massive, lifelong comic book fan. Once on board, Raimi opted to cut Doc Ock from the script, realizing the story was much stronger and emotionally grounded when it focused on the surrogate father-son dynamic between Norman and Peter. When it came time to bring the Green Goblin to the big screen, the initial approach to the villain's iconic look was vastly different, and significantly more terrifying than the rigid helmet we eventually got. The original concept featured a highly advanced animatronic mask, created by the practical effects studio Amalgamated Dynamics. The mask would have completely covered the actor's face, and utilized a material that looked and moved much more like actual skin. But despite the incredible technical achievement, the design was ultimately scrapped for a couple of reasons. First, Raimi worried it was too terrifying for kids, and two, the mask would have been incredibly difficult and time-consuming to use on set, requiring the actor playing him to wear a heavy rig and an off-camera crew with controllers just to operate the animatronics. Plus, once Willem Dafoe was cast in the role, he bluntly described it as a silly-looking Halloween mask. Ultimately, pivoting away from the animatronics came down to prioritizing the actor's performance. Dafoe was so notoriously expressive that Raimi simply didn't want to bury his natural, manic facial expressions under a thick, complicated mechanical rig. As a result, during this developmental phase, the team conceptualized a version of the helmet that would have physically opened up to reveal Dafoe's face underneath. But this was abandoned since in the storyline, nobody could know who the Goblin was. Eventually, they settled on a static helmet featuring yellow lenses that could retract to expose Dafoe's eyes, and paired it with a black mesh over the mouth area so audiences could see his mouth moving as he spoke. The desire to just show Dafoe's face, however, would eventually come full circle 2 decades later, when Dafoe returned to the role in No Way Home, as the filmmakers ditched the Goblin mask completely, finally allowing Dafoe's terrifying, unfiltered face to carry the character entirely on its own. Perhaps the most hotly debated change from the comic books leading up to the film's release was the decision to give Peter Parker organic web shooters. The concept actually originated years earlier from James Cameron's unmade, darker version of the film. Cameron wanted to heavily lean into the spider bite as a metaphor for puberty. This approach led to a scene in the script where Peter wakes up to find his bed covered in webbing. However, Raimi didn't abandon the mechanical web shooters entirely. Early on, he tried to strike a compromise. Peter's body would produce the webbing organically, but he wouldn't be able to properly guide or aim it. To solve this, he would invent mechanical gauntlets to channel the organic webs for swinging. This hybrid approach actually made it quite far into development. In fact, the famous scene where Peter tests out his webs and accidentally ruins his bedroom was originally shot with these mechanical shooters on his wrists. However, Raimi would later change his mind, feeling the idea of a high school kid building web shooters was unbelievable. According to Tobey Maguire, he felt that Peter Parker was such an unprecedented world-class genius that he could invent revolutionary high-tech mechanical web shooters in his bedroom in a matter of days. Why on earth would he be so broke and struggling to make ends meet by selling freelance photos to a newspaper? As for casting, initially the studio's top choice for Peter Parker was Heath Ledger. However, Ledger immediately turned it down, saying he didn't want to take someone else's dream away of playing Spider-Man. When Freddie Prinze Jr. met with Raimi asked him a simple question: "Tell me why you love Spider-Man." Freddie then launched into an enthusiastic, passionate rant all about his love for Venom. When he was finished, Raimi bluntly replied, "Well, we're not doing Venom, we're doing Spider-Man," ultimately costing him the job. Ultimately, Raimi found his Peter Parker thanks to his wife, who saw Tobey Maguire's performance in The Cider House Rules, and convinced him that he was the guy. The studio, however, wasn't as convinced, especially on the idea of Maguire as an action star. To prove them wrong, Raimi and Maguire shot a gritty screen test featuring a shirtless Tobey viciously beating up a group of bad guys. This visceral footage proved he had the physicality and intensity for the role, and the studio finally signed off. Casting the role of Mary Jane Watson proved to be equally complicated. Kate Hudson was originally offered the part, but she turned it down to star in the historical drama The Four Feathers. Elizabeth Banks also screen tested, but despite being only 16 months older than Maguire, the 28-year-old actress was deemed too old by the studio to play the high schooler. However, as a consolation prize, she was offered the role of J. Jonah Jameson's secretary, Betty Brant, instead. With just 1 month left before principal photography was scheduled to begin, 18-year-old Kirsten Dunst was officially cast as Mary Jane. The supporting cast also had its share of near misses. Spider-Man co-creator Stan Lee actively lobbied to play J. Jonah Jameson, since the character was modeled after him. However, the filmmakers felt the legendary writer was too old and lacked the acting chops to pull it off. Thankfully, there were no hard feelings. After seeing the film, Stan Lee was incredibly supportive of the eventual casting of J.K. Simmons. Finally, in what would have been a massive, groundbreaking cinematic crossover, Hugh Jackman was actually supposed to make a cameo appearance as Wolverine from Fox's X-Men franchise. Kevin Feige and the filmmakers tried to coordinate a quick walkthrough or visual gag while Jackman was in New York during production. However, according to Jackman, the cameo was ultimately scrapped when they couldn't find Wolverine's suit. When Spider-Man was in production, no one could have predicted the real-world tragedy that would profoundly alter both the film's marketing and its final thematic resonance. The September 11th attacks occurred just months after filming wrapped, forcing Sony and director Sam Raimi to pivot significantly. The most immediate casualties were in the film's promotional materials. Sony quickly recalled a stunning teaser poster that featured a close-up of Spider-Man's mask with the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center reflected in his eye. They also pulled the now legendary teaser trailer, which notably was a standalone promo not directed by Sam Raimi, that featured a bank-robbing helicopter getting snared in a massive spider web strung between the two towers. But the changes extended into the actual film itself, as Raimi actively leaned into the resilience and solidarity of the city in the wake of the tragedy. During the climax, a sequence was added featuring everyday New Yorkers pelting the Green Goblin with debris to protect their hero, shouting the now unforgettable line, "You mess with one of us, you mess with all of us." Raimi also added a shot of Spider-Man at the end perched next to a billowing American flag. However, earlier drafts of the script featured the Twin Towers much more significantly. Originally, the film opened and closed with Spider-Man hanging upside down from the antenna of the World Trade Center. Additionally, the tense scene where a paralyzed, out-of-it Spider-Man is forced to listen to the Green Goblin pitch a villainous team-up originally took place atop one of the towers. However, those moments were changed long before the September 11th attacks took place. Ultimately, these late-stage changes transformed Spider-Man from a standard superhero origin story into a deeply patriotic film and a profound love letter to the unbreakable spirit of New York City. Thanks for watching, everybody, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more of Hollywood's untold stories and unmade movies.